Talk to me about a K-shaped, not recovery, but economy. Because I wonder if one of the things we're seeing here increasingly, I wonder if you've seen this over your career, increasingly is there are the haves, the better educated, highly skilled, better paid, and the have-nots, the people who are less educated, less skilled, and they get left behind. When things turn down, they get really hurt, and they're the last to come back.
Yes, in fact, we are seeing that, and we know, for example, that the wealthiest Americans actually have become more wealthy during the pandemic, and those that are struggling have struggled more. It is also true, as you pointed out, that the unemployment, those who have lost jobs, are disproportionately women and people of color and in lower wage jobs. And I think there are two other structural things we have to worry about, even as this good economic news hits today. In addition to disproportionate impact on women and people of color, and that is that big companies are getting bigger and more small businesses are getting crushed. And I think the other thing is there are some of these jobs that are just not coming back, either because industries have had to consolidate or because people are using technology a lot more aggressively than they were before the pandemic.
So that raises the question, of course, what should be done about it? What can be done about it? You've long had an interest in public policy. Let's talk about the wealth tax first, and then maybe talk about some other possibilities. What do you think about that idea of saying, boy, if you're really wealthy, it's $50 billion plus, $50 million plus. If you're really wealthy, you should give us some more of your money so we can give it to other people.
Look, the concept of taxing a dollar above 50 million by 1 or 2 or 3 cents, that sounds reasonable, right? And there are a lot of really wealthy people saying, yes, I'd be prepared to do that. I have no trouble with the concept. Where I have trouble is somehow we never get to the what will we spend the money on and how will we level the playing field. So it's a great concept to say we're going to tax the wealthy so that we can level the playing field. The devil is in the details. How will we level the playing field? Where will the money be spent? How will we know that the money that we gain from the wealth tax is actually being spent to level the playing field? There are many good things to spend this money on, whether it's additional training, additional education, access to the internet. It's the coupling of the money raised to the money spent. And this is where government always falls down. Let's just face it, government always wants more money. The question is, do they spend the money the way it was intended to be spent? And I just haven't seen any details on what do you do with all this money.
Yeah, I haven't seen many details either. Another issue you've raised before, Carly, is who's actually spending this money? I mean, do we do it at a federal level? Or, as you like to say, should we have block grants and let some of the states and local governments who really know what the needs are spend it?
Yes, exactly. Who spends the money? I, of course, as you point out, always advocate as much as possible for distributing the responsibility for spending money closer to where the problems are, because in my experience, people closer to the problem understand the problem better. If all of this money, $1 trillion plus, is coming into the federal government without any accountability for how that money will be spent, I fear we're going to be disappointed with a playing field that remains on level despite a lot more money in the federal coffers.
Carly, let's turn to a sector that you know terribly well, which is tech. Tech stocks have really taken it on the chin this week, in part because the 10-year yield has gone up so much. But one of the issues here is the supply chain. And I've talked to now some people in this area who say part of the problem is there was not enough investment in capacity and inventory. We have a real crisis in the country when it comes to supply chain of chips.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, first, let's just say, I mean, yes, technology has taken it on the chin this week, but they've had a pretty great run. In fact, there are a number of tech stocks where people would say the fundamentals can't possibly justify the price. So let's say they've had a great run here. Yes, we do have an issue with the supply chain around chips, and I think it brings up the larger issue, which has been around for a long time, which is why is it that the United States has not been, in the past, as attractive an environment in which to build manufacturing capacity as, say, some others? We ought to be a manufacturing location of choice. We are not yet, although we're making progress. And so it's not just chips, it's a whole bunch of things. But clearly for chips, which is a critical component for so many things, more of an American supply is prudent, I think. The other thing I would just add, David, and you and I have talked about this before, one of the things I think the pandemic has revealed is we should have more redundancy in our supply chains. We should have more diversity in our supply chains because you never know what's going to happen, and redundancy and diversity always help you get through the tough times.
So should there be direct government investment in some of the manufacturing facilities, for example, for chips, or is it more a matter of providing incentives and let the market take care of it?
Well, I think you could see a combination of both. Look, we know, for example, that government directly invests in certain end products, airplanes, for example, has done that for a long time. So I think you could make an argument that for key components, the government should be an investor, perhaps a purchaser of choice. But I think the market can also do a lot of this with the right incentives.
Carly Fiorina writes a weekly newsletter for LinkedIn. She calls it Leadership Matters. She takes us through the fundamentals of leadership that she has developed and used through the years. This week's installment is about why a leader needs to be humble as well as strong and confident. It's called In Praise of Humility. So Carly, terrific always to go through these newsletters with you. This is a really tricky one, I think, because a lot of leaders are concerned that if they do appear to be humble, they'll be taken to be weak.
Exactly. People, when they hear the word humility, they equate it to weakness or insecurity. And actually, humility is not that at all. Humility is a necessary leavening, a necessary balance, if you will, to strengthen confidence. For example, a strong leader speaks their mind. A humble leader allows others to speak their mind as well. A confident leader understands that they can add value. They balance it with the humility to understand that others can add value. A confident leader understands that they can make a decision. A humble leader knows they sometimes need input to make the right decision. A confident leader understands their strengths and relies on them. A humble leader understands the areas where they may not be as strong and balances their team with people who can bring those qualities to the table. So without the leavening of humility, strength and confidence very quickly become arrogance, and arrogance is dangerous because when a leader gets arrogant, they become isolated, they hear what they want to hear, people tell them what they want to hear, and a mistake is going to get made.
It strikes me there's an internal part to this and an external part of this, and I'd like to, if we could, go through those. First of all, it sounds sort of clear-cut that you want to be this, you want to be this, but as a leader, are you constantly having a debate with yourself? How sure am I? How confident am I? Am I being too arrogant? Am I pushing too hard? Am I not pushing hard enough? How do you get a sense of that and make sure that you sort of keep relatively in balance?
Well, first, David, I think your question is one that a seasoned and self-aware leader would ask. You know, it's always amazing to me how many people are in huge positions of responsibility and they really lack self-awareness and they don't always ask those introspective questions. And those questions of introspection really are important. But secondly, I do think that this is why leaders need people around them who are willing to tell them the truth. In addition to being self-aware and introspective, I think all of us need to ask people sometimes for their point of view. There's nothing wrong with a leader saying, you know what, on this particular decision, I feel as though I need some more information. And there's also nothing wrong with a leader saying, okay, I don't have all the information necessarily, but I feel that it's timely that I make a decision, and then hear what other people have to say. A strong leader is never going to be misinterpreted as a wimp who isn't willing to make a decision. What's more dangerous is when a leader is misinterpreted as someone who will always make a decision whether they have gathered sufficient input or not. That's the kind of strength that becomes arrogance that ultimately leads to a mistake. And eventually a big mistake, usually.
And talk about that misinterpretation, that possible misinterpretation, because that's the external part, because maybe you're doing it exactly right. Did you ever have experiences where you were concerned, at least, about people misinterpreting your humility for being a weakness that they could step into?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, that's real. And I will say, David, honestly, as a woman in a man's world most of the time, I was frequently concerned that people were perceiving me as weak because I wasn't a man. So yes, that's real. And I think a leader needs to build their reputation over time. That also takes strength and confidence. So over time, if a leader has been decisive and strong and confident, there is less opportunity to misinterpret the humility of saying, I'd really appreciate your input here, or this is my role, what do you think your role is? Or this is my opinion, what is your opinion? Or most importantly, perhaps, a strong, confident, but humble leader will ask the question, what am I missing? And sometimes that's the most important question of all.
I'm glad you raised the question of your being a woman and a leader, because it's something, of course, I've not experienced. And I've often wondered, having watched other people through the years, women particularly, is it particularly challenging because men have a lot of role models, a lot of people you can sort of borrow a little bit of this person's, a little bit of that person's. I've seen some women in strong positions, and some go overboard on being masculine, frankly, and being overbearing, being overly competent. Others go the other direction. Is it more challenging, do you think, to this day for a woman coming up, or has that changed?
Well, things have changed, but I think it is more challenging still for a couple reasons. Number one, I think so often people want conformity. So in other words, when I was coming up, literally women were told to dress as much like men as possible. I mean, there's conformity for you. And I think a lot of times men expect a woman to act like them, and so women feel they need to get into that role as opposed to being themselves. The other thing that I think sometimes is very challenging for women is women very much want to be liked. Sometimes that's of more concern to women than it is to men. And so if you're concerned about being liked, then you don't always want to bring up the important issue that is nevertheless an unpopular issue. So yes, I think it is more challenging, but hopefully as we get more and more experience with women in the C-suite as well as the workplace in general, women are going to have an easier time as we go forward.
Finally, Carmen, something maybe out of left field, but it occurred to me as I read your newsletter this week, and that is optimism, the role of optimism for a leader. Because one of the things my wife taught me, she worked for Ronald Reagan at one point, is the most important thing you can be as a leader is optimist. Because your troops don't want to hear you got a problem. But how can you be optimistic without being overbearing, without really brushing under the rug the problems?
Well, you know, we've just talked about balancing strength and confidence with humility. And I think optimism is a critical quality of a leader. It has to be balanced with realism. A leader builds credibility because they are clear-eyed and realistic about the challenges they face, but they are optimistic enough to believe that things can get better.